Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. And good evening. Good evening. I'm Michael Weeks of Beta Sigma Boule, where I serve in the capacity of the Sire Archon. And on behalf of the membership of the 26 Archons, I welcome you to our webinar that's part of our W.E.B. Du Bois Public Policy Series. The forum today is Massachusetts Justice, Equity, Accountability, and Law Enforcement Act, frequently referred to as the Police Reform Act, that was signed into law December 31st, 2020. The elements in this law have significant impact on policing in our communities in Massachusetts, and it is our intent to provide a better understanding of the law, albeit time will not permit a comprehensive review today. First, you might ask, what is the Sigma Pi Phi fraternity? Well, it was founded in 1905. It is the oldest Black fraternity in the nation, with over 5,000 archons across the nation. Some are well known internationally, like notable archons Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Congressman John Lewis, Wynton Marsalis, Ken Chenault, and many others. And the Beta Sigma Boule is the local chapter, if you will, of Sigma Pi Phi. It was founded in Springfield in 1983 and has an ambitious social action and educational development agenda. So what do? Well, annually, we award nearly 22,000 in college scholarships to aspiring high school students in and around the area. We're also the major sponsor of the Martin Luther King Family Services Center HBCU Tour and their HBCU College Fair, helping hundreds of students better understand the rich legacy of our nation's historically Black colleges and universities. We're also a sponsor of the Amherst A Better Chance program, and we are proudly affiliated with the Basketball Hall of Fame, the NBA Retired Players Association, and Springfield College with our annual Education and Leadership Luncheon Forum that provides an inspiring learning opportunity to nearly 100 area youth every year to meet and hear from NBA and WNBA stars. We're planning a September forum, of course, for the class of 2021. Now, last year, we held a multifaceted campaign to get people to the polls. We used billboards, radio, geofencing, flyers, and speaking engagements. And we also did a very interesting forum on the education achievement gap. Now, our W.E.B. Du Bois Public Policy Series advances the community's understanding of matters we believe are critical concern. One matter that affects communities of college throughout this nation and in Massachusetts is policing and the need for reform. Far too often, we have seen policing in our communities go wrong and lead to unnecessary incarcerations, deaths, and the destructions of many lives. We know that policing is often the entry into a criminal justice system that is marred with institutional racism, creating and promoting racial disparities in policing, arrest, sentencing, and incarceration. This evening, we want to explore some parts of that law with you. And so we've assembled an august panel to help us to understand this law, and we'll have a limited time for Q&A later on. To moderate this session, we've asked our immediate past Sire Archon, Jeff Johnson, who I might add will become the first Black to be head of the Actuarial Foundation in a year. He's also an expert in financial services and is a trusted voice for this role. I now turn over the stage to Archon Johnson.
Thank you, Sire Archon Weeks. Good evening. It is my pleasure to serve as your moderator. Jurisdictions around the country have taken steps to address police reform. What advocates are looking for is accountability, transparency, and a fundamental change in the way police departments police their communities. Some jurisdictions have focused on restricting use of force, while others are prohibiting no-knock warrants. And still others are mandating certain training for police officers. I'm happy to say that Massachusetts has taken a more comprehensive approach. The Justice, Equity, and Accountability in Law Enforcement Act has specific provisions to address police conduct. In addition, it creates several commissions including for the first time in Massachusetts, the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, also known as POST. Time does not allow us to cover every provision in the Act, but we will discuss most of the key changes. We strongly urge each of you to take time to read the entire Act. A link to the Act will be provided at the end of the presentation. We are fortunate this evening to have a distinguished panel of officials who will inform us on what is in the law and share their perspectives on the topic. Viewers may submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I know that some questions have already been submitted. These questions will be taken following each of the commenters, each of our statements from our panelists, and we'll have ample time for that. But let me move to talking about the panelists. So our first panelist, State Senator Eric P. Lesser from the First Hampden and Hampshire District. Welcome, Senator Lesser. Next, we have State Representative Bud L. Williams from the 11th Hampden District. Welcome, State Representative Williams. Next, we have Sheriff Stephen W. Tompkins from the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. I will mention that Sheriff Tompkins is also the Massachusetts chapter president and Region 1 Vice President of Noble, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. The region that he's vice president for includes New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. And he's also president of the Massachusetts Sheriff's Association. Our final member of this distinguished panel this evening is Chief Mike J. Wynn from the Pittsfield Police Department. Chief Wynn also has the distinguished position of being recently appointed by the governor to the newly formed Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission. Welcome to all of our panelists. Before discussing the specific provisions of the Act, I will provide you with a general timeline for this important legislation. In June of last year, the governor, the Senate, and the House introduced police reform bills. During July, they worked to reconcile the various bills, and they determined that additional time would be needed to complete the deliberations. So the House and Senate agreed to extend the session until January 5th of 2021 to allow more time rather than allowing the formal session to end in July of 2020. These efforts produced a bill which was signed into law by the governor on December 31st, 2020. And with that overview of the timeline, I do want to start with some questions. And Senator Lesser, what did it take to achieve bipartisanship among the three bodies, the administration, the Senate, the House, to get the bill passed?
Can everybody hear me okay? Everybody, yes. And everybody can see me okay? Okay, so first I just want to thank you, Mr. Johnson, for moderating today. And I want to thank Michael for coordinating all the Zoom here and the invitation. And certainly want to thank my colleagues in government who join me. And Rep. Williams can chime in on this because this was obviously not an easy piece of legislation to get done. And one thing I do want to point out and recognize, because I think it's very important to acknowledge, is that many of the elements of this ultimate package that was signed by the governor and passed by both branches of the legislature had been pending at the State House for a long time. And there had been many different versions and different pieces of the bill that had been filed by different legislators over the years. So one of the most important things that happened over the summer was those pieces of existing proposals that had been out there for a long time and that many legislators had been fighting for a long time were finally put to the front of the conversation and combined into a broad holistic package and then moved through each branch. And I'll say there were points where there was a lot of tension, certainly. There were points where at multiple opportunities, frankly, the whole thing could have and almost did fall apart. But I do want to acknowledge and give credit to a really broad group of people in the House, in the Senate, and the governor and his team that did work in a spirit of collaboration to get something comprehensive done. But I think the most important thing to kind of remember is that a lot of these ideas, the post legislation in particular, have been filed for multiple sessions previously, and so people who had been around these issues knew what had to happen. And there were drafts, there were proposals that had already been filed that could be turned to and could be implemented and that was really the starting point.
Thank you. And Representative Williams, I invite you to add your context and maybe if you could also comment on how were citizens and law enforcement able to provide input. You're on mute, Representative Williams. Still can't hear you.
You can.
Okay.
First of all, I think Senator Lesser really pinpointed exactly what needed to be done. Most of this legislation had been around for years. The no-knock situations, excessive force, POST. Matter of fact, the Police Officers Association supported POST, which is the Peace Officers Certification, over 10 years ago. But what happened more recently, Governor Baker had filed the POST, didn't get much traction. And then Rep. Holmes out of Mattapan, he filed it. I was the only co-sponsor in the House, on the House side, that actually co-sponsored POST. But what happened? We had a George Floyd moment. That's what happened. And with the situation with George Floyd, the 9 minutes and some odd seconds now instead of 8, that gave us the traction, the initiative, the momentum, the inertia, the energy to get stuff done. And I want to commend the leadership in the House and the Senate for really, and the Black and Latino caucus, which really helped drive this agenda. So we were able, we extended the session. It was pretty contentious because there's a lot of opposition. Some of the police officers were very vocal against it. Some citizens, friends of the police department, friends of the police association, and regular citizens. But with the leadership in the Senate and the House, we're able to sit down, hammer it out, and get a real first step comprehensive program. And you said it, Mr. Leader, that this was a real comprehension program that we tried to put together. So certainly, as again, I want to commend in the House for really reaching out. And it was really input. We had the public meetings, we had public sessions. You could testify, you could write in, you could Zoom in. It was a lot of input. It was really an open process, a lot of transparency. And I think we had a good bill, good overall comprehensive bill.
Thank you. Sheriff Tompkins, could you comment on how law enforcement was represented during the crafting of the bill and what has been the reaction among police executives or unions since the bill has been passed?
Well, there's a couple. First, thank you for inviting me to this conversation. And as a member of Iota Phi Theta Fraternity Incorporated, I'm honored to be sitting with my Sigma brothers, frankly, to have this very insightful conversation. Insofar as, now keep in mind, I'm not police and we have policing powers, but we do not effectuate those powers. We leave that to the Boston police. And so we are in essence the back of the train. We are the caboose. After you've gone through the systems with the police, the courts, you come to us. Insofar as the legislation was concerned, frankly, the sheriffs were taking just a touch back a bit because our voice really wasn't included as much as we would have liked to have had that. And in this post-commission, we didn't have a seat on the post-commission. And so there are some things about corrections, particularly around de-escalation, that we would have liked to have had our voices heard on that, because I think that we could have brought some real texture to the conversation. There's some other things that we do internally that the police don't do because that's not a part of their mandate. With that said, we feel that the bill is a comprehensive bill. We realize that it did take a lot of time to get it done. Unfortunately, as my good friend Budell just referenced, we had to have an unfortunate moment for the wheels of justice to turn and move this forward. And I do believe, and the legislators, I hope, will agree with me and others that this is the first step in a long journey, and that we can build on this. And I think it was way past time for some legislation like this to come forward so that we can really begin to have conversations like this and other conversations as to how we fine tune that bill. But in the macro, for the most part, we're pleased with what the legislators have put forth.
Thank you. And it comes to mind, Chief Wynn, I didn't know if you had a comment based on what's been heard, or for Senator Lesser or Representative Williams, if you had a response to Sheriff Tompkins, but Chief Wynn first.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Like my fellow panelists, I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to be here this evening. And I think that I'm going to try to couch my comments by spinning off of all three of my fellow panelists. As Representative Williams said, there was some contentious moments, particularly when the bill was in conference committee. And from my perspective, both as a police chief and as a police officer, some of those contentious moments came down to what we felt was a lack of communication. Particularly the Massachusetts Chiefs of Police Association had a lot of research that we had been working on for the last 6 years that we wanted to get into the conference committee. And we didn't feel that we were given the opportunity on that, especially as the senator said around post, because we had been advocating for post and the certification process for over a decade. And so we felt that there was some lost opportunities. Ultimately, once the governor signed the bill, one of my fellow police chiefs looked at the language and said, if we had just phrased this police improvement instead of police reform in Massachusetts, it would have gone through much faster, because Massachusetts law enforcement had been doing this work since 2015 after Ferguson, and we had already checked off a lot of these boxes. All in all, I agree with the sheriff that the bill is comprehensive. There's a lot of good things in here. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. I've been in one public post-C meeting and one working group. And we're coming up with a lot more questions and we are answers. There's a lot of work ahead of us and a lot of tight deadlines, but we've got a great team to start working on it. And Sheriff, until we amend the legislation, I'll represent you.
That would be, thank you, sir. That would be greatly appreciated. At this time in the country's history, with political upheaval and racial strife, it's good to see the collaboration amongst law enforcement and our governing bodies come together to really embrace the whole thing about we the people, frankly, and how we the people are going to take care of our families and our communities. So thank you for that, officer. I appreciate that, and we'll take you up on that. And this I think is just a real textured moment in the country's history, and we can do some really good, positive things. It's going to take us much further down the road.
Thank you.
If I could just quickly add something to that. That's just building off of what Sheriff Tompkins had mentioned and what Williams was saying about the catalyst. Certainly, George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd was a very important and probably the most important catalyst for sure. But one other element that was very significant that I think did impact the debate, at least in the Senate, where I can speak the most directly, was that around the same time that we were debating this legislation, the Federal Department of Justice report was released on the Springfield police. And there had been a line of argument and there had been a kind of I don't want to necessarily say defense, but there had been a line of argument that had said Ferguson, pointing to Ferguson, pointing to Minneapolis, other places, saying this can't happen in Massachusetts, this doesn't happen in Massachusetts. And frankly, after that Department of Justice report came out, which was last summer around the time that this debate was happening, it became impossible just from the pure factual record that was created by that report to deny that we had issues in Massachusetts as well. And I read, because I felt it was important to do so, I read a portion of that report into the record on the floor of the Senate when we were doing our debate on this legislation for exactly that reason, because we wanted to make sure that we were grounding this conversation in what was happening in Massachusetts also, not only what was happening in the country at large. And so I think that was a very important motivating element to this as well.
Thank you.
And may I add something? We tend to forget our former Chief Justice Gantz, who has passed away. God rest his soul. But Chief Gantz, when we used to meet with Chief Gantz, Black Latino Caucus, and he always talked about the Harvard study. And you need to take a look at the Harvard study because it talks about the conditions in Massachusetts. But he was able to help and guide us, and he was a beacon of light when it came to police reform. He was early on supporting police reform before the George Floyd moment. So I just want to interject that along with now Chief Justice Kimberly Budd, who were very instrumental in helping the Black and Latino Caucus and guiding us in terms of best practices. So I want to get that in. If you have a chance, gentlemen, read the Harvard study. It talks about some conditions in Massachusetts will blow your mind.
Thank you, Representative Williams. And part of my role as the moderator is to keep us moving forward. So I would like to move the events forward to, and certainly for those that are not as familiar with the particular act and its provisions, is Chief Wynn, if you could provide us with an overview of some of the key provisions, including the ban on chokeholds, the duty to intervene, qualified immunity, and the mandated training, and some other items. Chief Wynn.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you. So again, in preparing for this evening, I met with my former colleague, Chief Whitehead, and he asked me to focus my attention on a couple key areas of the legislation. And as the moderator said, we don't have nearly enough time this evening to go into this in any detail. But we did identify some key areas that we thought members of the public should be aware of. And by way of introduction, I have to say that the Massachusetts police reform legislation now statutorily memorializes some things that, as I said, we were already doing or working on. So the first one that I was asked to speak about is the outright prohibition of chokeholds or vascular neck restraints or lateral vascular neck restraints. And although those had not been trained techniques in the Commonwealth or in the Municipal Police Training Committee for decades, the legislation formally prohibits them and bans them. So the MPTC is now working on new use of force policies and regulations regarding that. That it's interestingly enough in Pittsfield, we had stricken the language mentioning them from our policy in 2018 because we hadn't used them in so long. And now we're modifying the policy to add the prohibition back in. Duty to intervene, duty to intercede, and duty to report. Again, it's formal statutory action to memorialize something that had already been case law in the Commonwealth since 1993. The case of Commonwealth v. Adams had already placed the constitutional requirement on us, and we were teaching it in the academy. But now it's statutorily required that if an officer observes another officer doing something that they believe is excessive force, that they take steps to stop it. And that more importantly, which was not included in Commonwealth v. Adams, that they then report it to a supervisor before the end of their shift. De-escalation tactics and use of force, as I said in my previous remarks, this is something that as a police chief and as a trainer, I was very happy that we had already implemented prior to the passage of the law. 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, in our required mandatory in-service, we implemented across the Commonwealth the Police Executive Research Forum's ICAT, Integrating Communications Assessment and Tactics curriculum, which is a de-escalation tool that we've been teaching both in the academy and in our in-service. So this, again, is formalizing that. Discharging a firearm into or at a fleeing vehicle, again, something that most policies had already addressed, but now specifically prohibiting it. The changes in qualified immunity are very specific. This is probably the one that caused the most contention from police officers and some of the police unions. It's tied to the loss of certification of being decertified through the post commission, which in many cases would have been resulted in criminal charges anyway. So that particular provision is kind of moot. And then it's also tied to any sustained allegations of bias-based policing. And those are two areas that police officers in general should avoid finding themselves in, and you probably wouldn't have gotten qualified immunity if you had that. So we're telling our officers that one's not as big a deal as it was made out to be during some of the negotiations. The no-knock warrant restrictions, that's really a tightening of existing law. We already had a no-knock provision in our warrant application. It was previously allowed by a clerk magistrate. Now it's required that the no-knock provision be signed by a judge. So a little bit of a higher level of judicial oversight. And there is some requirement for justification and documentation in the event that you can't make an appropriate announcement. Next on the list is the facial recognition. I can't really talk about this one yet because this is one of those required commissions. There's a facial recognition commission that is just being seated. Prior to being named to the post, I was the Mass Chief's representative to facial recognition. I attended one meeting where I learned more about facial recognition than I've ever learned in my career before. I think my personal opinion is I think this is one that kind of made it into the legislation because of some stuff that was happening elsewhere in the country. Realistically, in the Commonwealth, with the exception of some of the larger departments, this is something that we all rely on the state police to do through the registry of motor vehicles anyway. I'm not aware of any small municipal departments that even had access to that technology. And essentially, this formalizes the process that was already in place that you have to apply through a judge to get it from the state police, who can only do it through the registry of motor vehicles. So that's more of a process change than anything else. The changes around mass demonstrations and protests and the utilization of tear gas and/or rubber bullets or kinetic impact rounds or canines during mass demonstrations and protests, I think that, from my personal opinion, that's some needed clarity. I'm blessed that as a small city Western Mass chief out here on the frontier, that's not something that my department has had to deal with before last year. And even in the cases that we had to deal with it last year, as I said before we started the webinar, we were able to handle that through good relationships and good communication rather than mass deployments. But there was so much confusion, not just across the Commonwealth, but across the country with what's allowed when and what should be employed when, that I actually see that as a good thing, not just for the Commonwealth, but for the country, because it's really going to set some across the board standards. And then the last one on the list that we came up with was some of the mandated training. And I was a trainer before I was a chief. I serve as a trainer now. I'm a big advocate for more training. If you're going to require more training, I think that's a positive. One of the interesting things for me on this particular list is a lot of the training that is now statutorily required, we had already required by regulation going into it. A lot of the training, particularly that training on dealing with special populations, has been in the academy for a number of years. But again, now it's memorialized and there are penalties for departments that don't keep up with their in-service mandates.
Thank you, Chief Nguyen. One question for just elaboration on the de-escalation tactics. Can you say a little bit more about what those tactics look like, or what we should expect to be more uniform as a result of this act?
No, I wish I could. So one of the things that came up during the only post-commission that I was in is there's not actually an agreed upon definition of de-escalation. I think it's something that we all know what we think it means, but it means different things to different people. And so I was having a conversation with a couple of my fellow commissioners during a working group, and what it means in a school setting and what it means in a residential setting and what it means in a field deployment by a police officer may be very, very different. In my experience as a police officer, what it means is not going into a contentious situation with a plan for a deliberate outcome, but going into the situation with a plan, a backup plan, a contingency plan, and maybe a bailout plan, and taking a moment to pause, use distance, maybe use natural barriers to establish communication before you pick a plan, instead of just rushing right in there. And if we can integrate communicating assessment with our tactics, then we can take advantage of time, distance, and barriers to find some more positive outcomes for everyone. And when I teach these tactics to my officers, that's better tactics for the officer too, because we're much less likely to see officers get injured when they pause before they commit to a physical confrontation.
I think, thank you, Chief Wynn. Sheriff Tompkins, I think you have a comment.
I have a question, Chief. So Tom Turco came to visit with the sheriffs a while back, and we had a conversation about these commissions. And in particular, there was one on training that I wanted to ask you about that I don't have a full understanding of, but there was some mention of a bridge academy wherein the corrections officers would be required to train as the police are trained. And our concern, meaning the sheriff's concern, is if that were to happen, our officers are going to want to be police. You know,
they're going to leave the facility and try to get a job with me.
Exactly. You know, and we're exactly, and we're going to lose some of our quality guys and ladies. Did I understand that correctly now? That this Bridge Academy is something wherein corrections officers would have to be trained as police.
So I was in the Municipal Police Training Committee yesterday as a guest, and I was in the Mass Chiefs E-Board meeting as a guest this morning. And this was the most contentious topic of conversation. And I know our listeners may not want this degree of detail, but I think this is important. And I think our legislators need to hear this as well. It's my opinion, again, that I don't think that when we went through the conference committee last year, that there was a clear understanding of how many small towns in the Commonwealth, particularly in the Western four counties, but also on the Cape and Islands, use part-time officers. And it's a lot. It's a lot of the departments. And so under the current language of the law, those part-time officers, depending on what letter their last name ends with, what letter of the alphabet, they're going to have a finite amount of time to bridge the gap between their part-time reserve intermittent academy and the equivalent of a full-time academy. And if they don't, they risk losing their certification. And so trying to figure out how we get somebody from what is essentially a 250-hour part-time academy to the equivalent of an 800-hour academy is being hotly debated every day. Now, my understanding when it comes to members of the sheriff's departments and the corrections officers, for your corrections officers or deputies who are reserve intermittent trained, who they have patrol powers on your transportation unit or something, if they want to retain those, whatever requirement is placed on a reserve officer is also going to be placed on them. Now, 2 weeks ago, it was going to be a Bridge Academy. You were going to have X amount of time to get it done, and then you were going to have to go do driving and firearms and DT. As of this morning, I'm not sure that that's still the plan. We know that we have to figure something out to get that training. For your officers, they wouldn't be happy about it, but they could do it on duty. For the part-time officers who work for 2 or 3 departments or they have another full-time job, we got to figure out a way forward. So that's very much a work in progress.
Thank you, sir.
All right. There is a question that comes to my mind, and it looks like in the chat it came to someone else's mind. So I want to give each of the panelists or those that want to comment on this. So from the way the act's been described, it sounds like there were a lot of things that were already being done and that it just sort of codified existing practices. And so the question that came in through the chat was to help them understand what was so controversial and why did it take the murder of George Floyd to pass them? And I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that or not.
I'll go.
Okay.
I think it's been said by all of us that a lot of this was already a work in progress, and much of the content of the legislation was already in the State House in various forms, smaller portions of it everywhere. And I can't say for certain why it took the murder of George Floyd to be the impetus for that. But that wasn't just in the Commonwealth, that was across the country. So again, 2014, post-Ferguson, 2015, the final report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, late 2015, the Massachusetts Chiefs written response to that report. We had realized that a lot of this stuff needed to get done. And what we were finding is that we could make some curriculum changes in the academies and we could make some policy recommendations, but for instance, the certification and decertification. That's been a hot button topic for police chiefs who are faced with hiring decisions every day, that we could get more information about somebody who had been decertified in another state who was a candidate for employee than we could for somebody who had previously been employed elsewhere in the Commonwealth. And unfortunately, that wasn't the type of stuff that the associations were going to be able to do without legislative action. And until the tragedy of George Floyd's murder, my own delegation, they didn't want to talk to me about these issues prior to last year. And after that murder, they wanted to talk to me all the time about these issues. So it was unfortunately, it took a tragedy to kind of get everybody looking in the same direction and moving in the same direction.
If I might, I would like to say a couple of things. The wheels of justice and the wheels of government move very slowly, as we know. And unfortunately, in this situation, an individual lost his life. But there are lots of individuals, both black and white, but the ones that you see a lot on the news are the black and brown men that are losing their lives. And when you have a buzz phrase like defund the police, that gets a spark into a lot of people, both those for and against that. And that, at least in my world, stimulated a lot of conversation. I'm not one that ascribes to defunding the police. You want to reprioritize dollars, you want to move some things around, that's fine. The next phrase that I've heard is reimagine policing, and that's fine also. But we needed a catalyst. Sorry, that's my dog. We needed a catalyst to get the ball rolling, and now that it's rolling, it's moving at I think a pretty good clip that's going to be sustainable, because people, both black and white, male and female, young and old, really want to have this discussion about how our police are going to take care of our communities.
Just to add to that, I think Rep. Williams, you want to go first?
You said in this country, when there's a black and brown moment, it's always a watershed moment. Slavery, Civil War, the Voting Act. What did it lead to the Voting Act? Dogs on individuals, black people not being able to vote. Housing, Civil Rights Bill, marches and demonstrations. That's always a watershed moment in this country. We've had a ton of them. I just disagree with Sheriff Thompson just a little bit in terms of sustaining the momentum with this George Floyd moment. Right now, it's really hot. People are really paying attention. And we're still getting cases, as the Louisiana case had just reared its ugly head with the AP video yesterday. I think if we don't keep the heat, keep feet to the fire, that this could eventually 3 or 4 years be on the back burner. And that typically happens with black and brown people. We look at the John Lewis Voting Act that we've been trying to get across the finish line for years, and it's mixing agendas. But that's what happens in America. They make promises, 40 acres and a mule. You're going to be able to work and live where you want to live. You're going to be able to buy houses. There always comes a time they never deliver. This is one of the first times in a long time, since maybe the Civil Rights Movement, that a big watershed moment in America, people deliver throughout the country. It always takes something earth-shattering to move things for black and brown people, in my opinion.
Thank you. Senator Lesser, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, just to clarify from the comments I made earlier, to Rep. Williams' point, there's a very, very big difference between a bill that gets filed, even a bill that gets a bunch of co-sponsors, even a bill that passes one house, or just passes the House or just passes the Senate, and a bill that actually gets signed into law and then gets implemented. And the implementation is going to be a big part of this too. And I know that's going to be a topic for today. But just to Rep. Williams' point, I mean, our colleague Rep. Holmes had been filing that legislation and had trouble getting traction for it. And it was after the catalyst of George Floyd's murder, unfortunately and tragically, that all of a sudden you saw a lot of things that many people had been working on for a long time, including many members of law enforcement, suddenly shoot forward, and actually pen went to paper and it became law. So these are very significant changes. We had done, and Rip Williams and I worked on this pretty intensely. We had done a very significant criminal justice reform back in 2018, but that was more focused on kind of the sheriff's end and the sort of sentencing and prosecution elements of less so police practices themselves. It was focused on mandatory minimums, drug sentencing, things like that, recidivism. But the policing issues, there is a very organized opposition to a lot of what we've tried to get done here, and a lot of the opposition, frankly, at times over the summer and through the fall was fairly vicious. And as a legislator, I'll say that the calls I was getting, the sort of the intensity of the opposition. There was certainly very intense support too, but there was very, very intense opposition. And I really give credit to the members of law enforcement that worked in common purpose with lawmakers to try to get something done that actually, helps people. And I do think that this law will help save lives in Massachusetts. And I think it's going to help police, and it's going to help the communities that police serve.
If I could just follow up on,
I'm sorry, Chief.
if I could just follow up on Representative Williams' comments, because I think we are at a watershed moment in this country, and particularly in the Commonwealth. And while I agree with the sheriff, I also share concerns that we could lose this moment of momentum. And so last summer, when I was doing some research on behalf of some of my representatives and community members, I was writing an article as a use of force instructor in response to the murder of George Floyd. I did a little bit of research, and I went back through what we consider to be the period of modern American policing, so post-civil rights. And I found 6 of those watershed moments, 3 in my relatively brief career, where there was fervor and there was outcry. And then when the interest waned, the only people left at the table doing the work were the police. And each time law enforcement leaders would say, we need federal assistance, we need strict standards, we need common standards. And then we would be the only ones doing the work, and everybody else would go back to whatever. We have an opportunity to fix this in the Commonwealth, but we have an obligation to share what we do with the Commonwealth with the rest of the country. And we need federal guidance and federal standards. There's 18,000 separate law enforcement agencies in this country. They all get to kind of pick and choose the way they want to do things. That's unacceptable. It's the only democratic country in the Western world that lets that happen.
Mr. Johnson, if I might, I also want to either add to or stand in deference with Representative Williams insofar as momentum or losing momentum. And I'll be quick about this. So back in, I believe it's 2008, we had the Obama family enter the White House. And the country was hoping that we were entering our kumbaya moment, and that we as a nation would understand that it's time to really embrace equality. Things in administration and some things that still needed some work. The administration that followed that showed us that we really do have a lot of work to do. We have a ton of work to do. And if anything that's remotely good, in my estimation, I'm just speaking for myself, that came out of that administration was the stimulation of people getting back into civic engagement. And people are now re-engaging with the process. They are re-engaging with government. If you look at what's happening here in Boston with our city council race and our mayor's race, there are a whole host of really good, vibrant candidates, men and women, black and white, frankly. And so people really want to see a thing that's going to be sustainable. I understand what Williams is saying is that we may possibly lose that forward motion, but I think that we're at a moment in time where people are just like, you know what, let's get this done and let's put something in place that's going to be sustainable.
Agreed. Let me real quick. I know you have to move, but I've been in the House a few years. The House vote was the closest vote of any vote I've ever been associated with. I don't think we had veto power. So there was so much, as Senator Lesser alluded to, was so much opposition, and the undercurrent during this legislation. There was put a lot of legislators on notice. It was a very close vote. We had a hold it, the Senate held theirs, the House held theirs, and we were able to put it together. Barring if that had not passed December 31st, coming in this year, I don't know if the outcome would have been the same. That's just my personal opinion. There was a lot of opposition. They put a lot of folks on notice, and they were playing police chief. They were playing pretty tough. Folks were playing pretty tough.
Thank you, Representative Williams. And this is a question I need to ask before we transition, both because it was first time I heard these words was in the news cycle nationally. We mentioned it this evening, qualified immunity, and certainly when it was mentioned during this act, there's going to be more study. So I guess if just to elaborate on why that approach was taken rather than just eliminating qualified immunity at one extreme, and certainly what are the possibilities for the future when it comes to qualified immunity?
Just to the point, I'll defer to Senator Lesser, who really played a major role in that. If you ask 5 or 6 different attorneys, what's the definition of qualified immunity? You're gonna get 5 or 6 different definitions. It isn't quite, and I'm for qualified immunity, not for police officers, you know, if they commit a crime that the taxpayer shouldn't have to pay for it. But I think we have to do it right. And I think when we get into the post, the House had a game plan to deal with the qualified immunity through the post, through the certification and decertification. So I mean, I was in the criminal justice system for over 30 years, been dealing with this qualified immunity for a long time, and still don't have a clear-cut path to how you do this. And you bring as Sheriff Tompkins, one of the renowned sheriffs in America, how do you sit people at the table and how do you deal with it? Because this is a very emotional issue. And this was the really one that really stirred the pot. The qualified immunity, that was the one that when that was on the table, it looked like all hell was going to break out on Beacon Hill.
Thank you, Representative Williams. And maybe with that, we'll move forward and talk about the next topic, or at least open up the discussion to talk about the newly created Massachusetts Peace Officer Standards and Training Commission, otherwise known as POST. And we'll note that 46 states already had a process for certifying and decertifying police officers, and that until this act was signed in December of 2020, Massachusetts was one of 4 states that did not have a process. But we're going to focus on the fact that the POST is here now. And Chief Nguyen, could you explain the purpose and makeup of the POST Commission?
I'll do my best. So I know that this, next to qualified immunity, this was one of the issues that caused a lot of contention and consternation is, you know, who's going to be on the post? What were the powers of the post going to be? Who gets to appoint the members of the post? And, you know, I'll speak for, you know, the law enforcement officers who were coming to me and they're saying if a doctor gets in trouble, you know, their sanctions are decided on by doctors. You know, we should get to decide on the sanctions for our own. That's kind of ridiculous, right? I mean, there's certainly the investigation should be done by trained, skilled investigators, but reasonable people should be able to look at a decision about somebody's egregious misconduct. And so ultimately, when it came out of the conference committee, you know, the composition of 9 members, and, you know, it's the governor got their appointment, his appointments, the attorney general got her appointments, and the legislature got some appointments, and they were designed to represent a wide swath of interests and a wide swath of experience. And so there are 9 members. It's primarily non-law enforcement members, 6 non-law enforcement members, 3 law enforcement members. And our statutory authority is to, you know, kind of create the structure to enable these reports to be investigated and to make decisions regarding certification and ultimately decertification. In addition to myself, the 2 other law enforcement members are the president of the Boston Police Officers Association and Boston Police Detective, who, you know, I've gotten to meet with a couple times, and I'm excited to get to know them better. And then the chair of the commission is a retired Superior Court judge who was appointed by the governor. And then we have a victim witness advocate from one of the DA's offices, a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma issues, a chaplain, an attorney. I think I got everybody. There's 9 of us, and I think that's everybody. And so, as I said, it's very, very much a work in progress. When the legislation was originally signed into law, it didn't come with an appropriation or funding. And so there's been a lot of scribbling trying to figure out exactly what the next steps are going to do. I want to give a lot of credit to the governor's office and the executive. They've been amazing trying to get us up and running and providing us with resources and support. The most important 2 items on our agenda as far as building the structure out right now are the hiring of a full-time professional executive director. That job was posted last week and it's got a very tight window and turnaround. And immediately after that, the hiring of a full-time professional general counsel to the post. And once we get the executive director and the general counsel, then we can start to focus on the staff who will actually start putting the certification and decertification process into place. Eventually, employed by the post, there needs to be an investigations unit and a certifications unit. Not really sure what that's going to look like or what the staff is going to be. And ultimately, we're also responsible for the administration, and we're not going to do the actual work, but the administration of a publicly viewable database of officers' discipline, misconduct, and decertification records.
Thank you.
I just
Go ahead.
want to say on that, first of all, we were very pleased that the governor appointed Chief Nguyen, a very balanced individual, a wealth of knowledge, just a good, decent human being. And the makeup was, we told Senator Lester it was going to be 15 members, 11 members, 12 members. We went back and forth. And then they decided on the 9 members, and we were going back and forth because the police officers or the peace officers wanted a majority, and the advocates or the lobbyists, they wanted. And so working with the governor's office, the Senate and the House, we came on with the 9, 6 outside of law enforcement and 3 in law enforcement. Thought it was a nice balance. I just want to say that decertification authority is going to be very, very important. And what the House version was that we didn't deal with qualified immunity, but we dealt with the Sheriff Tompkins. We dealt with the certification and decertification, saying that if an officer did something that was very egregious and they had the due process and they were found guilty of whatever they're doing, they would lose their certification. Once they lost the certification, then you could go after the qualified immunity would go away. So that was one way we looked at it. The Senate thought a little differently. So now we're talking about how do we really, because we really need to address qualified immunity, but it's such a complicated issue. It's not just let it go away. Because it's been, as Chief Nguyen said, that between the post and the qualified immunity, that was the most of the debate, the rhetoric, the emotional hijacking on both sides. So I'm just happy that we're able to get it done. And like I said, the post has been around for a decade. The Police Chiefs Association supported post over 10 years ago. They supported it, and we up until last 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, you had Rep. Holmes, myself, Senator Lester. It wasn't much conversation about it. We knew that it should exist, but the George Floyd moment, that watershed moment, drove that process, and we were able to get it over the finish line. And like I said, I've been in the House a few years. This is the closest vote we've ever had. I don't think we had veto sustainability. We didn't.
No.
We didn't have veto sustainability. We would have lost that if we didn't work that out with the governor, the House, and the Senate.
And at multiple points, it almost went up in smoke because of how close that vote was. Just Rep. Williams alluded to it, but that December 31 deadline, given how our session works, if you don't get the bill done by the end of the session, everything starts over when the new session starts. So this was a high wire act for sure.
I'd like to ask, the sheriffs asked a number of times to have at least one seat on this. and we were denied continuously. I hear what you're saying, Rep. Williams, about going back and forth with the number of individuals and the makeup of this group of people. But with all that goes on in corrections, we're just baffled that
Yeah.
sheriffs were not allowed to have a seat at the table. Can you tell me what that was about?
I really can't, Sheriff Tompkins, and I think at some point, then we need to talk about that. Because I've always supported the Sheriff's Association. I
Yeah.
supported you in your position, you know that. And we were in there really trying to push to make it happen. And unfortunately, I thought it was a value asset to have the other perspective of from your perspective, the sheriff's perspective. But we were pushing, I know Senator Lesser and myself and some other folk, it wasn't meant to be. Maybe we need to revisit that. I think it's a valuable piece it's not part of it. It's a clog in that machine that really needs to be there from my perspective. So
I know. Sheriff Tompkins, I think you make a good point. I mean, certainly my local sheriffs, reached out to me multiple times, and retired Sheriff Ash, when this was all going on. I don't have great visibility into the thought process necessarily in the conference, but I think part of it is really two things. One is the point that you were making earlier about how this was really about the sort of front-facing officer conduct, right? So the spots they wanted to have for the patrol officers, that because this bill was really very focused on the officer conduct issues out in the street, out in the community, and sheriffs, as you said, are more on the back end of that. But I'm not saying that that's correct or not, but I think that was part of the thought process. The other piece is, and this is kind of tied to Chief Wynn's just discussion of the post in general. There was very, very heated debate about how the post would be made up. And I can just speak for myself and probably for a balance of the legislators that did support these reforms, that it was our intention to make the post civilian led. Certainly, there needs to be a point of view of law enforcement on there. And I pushed for that, and there needed to be, and there is, procedural fairness. There's due process, there's appeals, there's hearings built in. So the officer, when they're accused, is going to get their chance to make their case. But by design, it was a civilian. It's a civilian led review effort, and I think that was a key controversy, right? Because not everybody in the legislature agreed with that. There were there was a point of view that said no, law enforcement should review law enforcement, and then there was a group of us that said at some point there needs to be a civilian non-law enforcement check on that, and that was a big controversy. That was a big source of disagreement.
Not to belabor it, and I'll end with this, that if in fact we're going to look at this, or you folk are going to look at this going forward, as I say, the way that folk are dealt with when they're incarcerated will have a direct effect on how they comport themselves when they are no longer incarcerated. And so just from the standpoint of what we do as you go forward, and I said, I'm not going to belabor it, but just if you can keep that on the burner somewhere, that we would like to be able to discuss what is it we do with individuals once they are in our care and custody, and how we can work collaboratively to reduce recidivism and interrupt criminality.
Thank you. There's a question that seems like it's very important to address if possible. So will post supersede civil service with respect to misconduct? And I'll give you the other question attached to that. Will officers have due process under post?
Yes, and part of the reform, we got civil service reform as part of this legislation too. We didn't talk about that. We're looking at civil service.
Talk about controversial, yeah.
We're looking at it, and I'll defer to Senator Lesser on that.
Go ahead, Senator.
Sorry, turned off mute. I mean, Chief Wynn can certainly chime in on this with the post. I mean, I do think that there is procedural fairness built into the review process. There is a heightened standard of review, and there's multiple opportunities, and it's going to be a thorough process. And both the certification process and the decertification process is not going to be a quick procedure. Where it comes to civil service, the ultimate decision to decertify, if an officer is decertified, they cannot serve in law enforcement in Massachusetts. There will be a requirement that you are certified to be a police officer. If you lose that certification, you cannot be a police officer, regardless of what your collective bargaining or civil service agreement says. And I think that's important because there are going to be occasions where an officer does something or there's conduct at the post after a thorough investigation, after reviews and appeals, finds they violated, that person should be taken off the street and they shouldn't have a badge anymore. But it's not going to be done haphazardly. It's not going to be done on a whim. There's safeguards built in. And again, that was another element of what was creating some of the sticking points, is what the standard of review was going to be, what the scrutiny level was going to be, how the appeals would work. But I think we landed in a good place, and I think the review we have in there is thorough.
I'm going to get myself in trouble with my fellow police officers, particularly those of us who are with civil service departments, and I'll just say, God, I hope so, because
I know.
if there's something that's as misunderstood in the Commonwealth as qualified immunity, it's civil service. So I'm a civil service chief. I lead a civil service department. I've been the chief for 14 years. I haven't had a misconduct case appealed to civil service in 12 years, because built into our collective bargaining agreement is also a guaranteed right that they can request arbitration. My management team and I always win at civil service. We always lose in arbitration. So we fight. We're fighting for a broken system that does. Civil service had its purpose, back in the day, to avoid nepotism and politicizing police officers. But the system itself is understaffed. It's underfunded. It's dying on the vine, and it serves no purpose for any of our people anymore. So there's a special commission within the police reform legislation to study civil service. My personal hope is that they're going to come back and determine that civil service is redundant, and that problem will go away.
But Chief, may I chime in? But we've heard from a lot of the police chiefs, and they echo the same sentiments of Chief Wynn, the majority of them. The conversation talking to the patrolmen's union or the officers union and talking to the police chief were completely different. So I want to thank you, Chief Wynn, for really cementing that idea. And that was
So
from the
I just
chiefs
want to
I
point out,
talked throughout the Commonwealth. Those chiefs really echoed your same sentiments.
I had to have this conversation with my patrol officers union in particular, but the ones who were really stuck on it were the supervisors, who are also unionized. And what they didn't understand, and it took me a long time to make them understand this, is they weren't going to lose anything, right? If civil service goes away, it goes away futuristically. They still retain their status, and they would only lose it if they lost their certification. So they're quite literally fighting for protection they're guaranteed.
I think conceptually, one of the best ways to describe the post system and the certification is it's similar to professional certifications that exist in really every other profession. And the way to kind of, I think, conceptually separate this, what the certification is going to mean versus what civil service or collective bargaining might mean, is like, I'm a lawyer. You have to pass the bar to be a lawyer. You have a bar card, a BBO number. If there is a malpractice claim or you do something unethical as an attorney, you could go to the attorney's employer, right, their law firm or the company they work for. That employer may or may not have a contract with that employee, may or may not take it seriously. But beyond their employer, they have their bar license, their legal license, and you could go directly to the Board of Bar Overseers to make a complaint. The same is true, by the way, for a nurse, for a doctor, for hairstylists in Massachusetts, for mechanics, for people who sell insurance. Really, every profession has a certification and sort of review process for for making sure that the profession and the people in that profession are doing what they're supposed to do. And I think that's the way to think about post. You could go to a department if an officer is doing something, but you now have this broader, higher level review, which is post, and you can go straight to that, which is not in the local department, but is done statewide and is about the officer's underlying certification to be an officer rather than be able to be employed in any specific department.
Thank you. And what I'd like to do is first remind the viewers, and some are already doing this, they can put questions into the Q&A and we will get to those either during insertion of those during the panel discussion currently, and certainly during the Q&A portion at the end. What I want to do now is to sort of go forward and talk more about the special commissions and task forces. And Senator Lesser or Representative Williams, I know that there are various task forces and special committees dealing with African Americans and Latinos, Latinas, and people with disabilities, and looking at structural racism and others. Could you give us a feel of what the purpose of these committees are? And could you comment as well, since a question came in about this, how citizens can participate in the work of the commissions and task forces?
And and thank you. And, the House just formed a new House Committee, Racial Justice, Social Equity, and Civil Rights, which I'm so fortunate to be the chairperson. And I think when leadership in the Commonwealth looked at all the structural racism within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the infrastructure, the outer structure, every aspect of life in Massachusetts, whether it's healthcare, economic development, criminal justice, education, mental health. We've had a structural problem. And I think the thinking was there's a lot into this bill. And I think Moderator Johnson, you had said to folks, please go up and read it. It's a lot. But I think what they're trying to do is have the first marker. This is the first step to look at the whole Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Every aspect of government and service in Massachusetts. There's the Boys Commission, Black boys, Puerto Rican boys, Asians. I'm on the criminal justice to study the trial court, the racism within the trial court systems. I just think they just said, hey, look, let's put it out there. Let's start. This is the first step. We know we got a long way to go. In any journey, the first step is the most important journey. So they put all this out there. So it's going to be a lot for you folks, all of us, to get involved in, to helpfully go to the root of the problems. And then I always say, until we get to the root of the situation, it's just a Band-Aid approach. And I don't think they want the Band-Aid approach. So the structural racism that exists and institutional racism that exists, I just think that was the thing. There's a lot of commissions in here. There's a lot. And I think once they got going and establishing what we established as a comprehensive situation, they said, hey, let's try and cover everything. So the blueprint is set. The next step, as Senator Lesser said and Sheriff Tompkins said, this is when the real work starts, putting these commissions together. And as I said, I think Chief Wynn, I think they're the post, I think they're up and running, basically. I know they've met. I know a couple of them might have met, but I think that was the thinking, just to put everything out there and let's go look at it.
And Senator Lesser, do you have an additional comment?
Yeah, I think, I think really just kind of everything that Rep. Williams said, and just to connect it back to something that I think is very compelling and very important, what Chief Wynn was saying about the survey he had done, the research he had done of all the different times that there had been calls for change. And at the end of the day, the change, a lot of the people calling for the change wither away, and police are left asking for more guidance and more clarity. This is really meant to address that. This is meant to, these commissions will be meeting for the next several months, in some cases the next several years, and are going to help guide continued reform and continued change on all of these very, very deep and systemic issues. So I think it's really about acknowledging the limitations of, as important as bill that was just passed is, and as significant progress as it represents, there's so much more that we have to do, and that's what these commissions are really about building momentum for.
Thank you. Sheriff Tompkins?
Yeah, I think these commissions are great, to tell you the God's honest truth. And we've had some discussion, particularly obviously around the status of African Americans, Latinos, Latinas, and racism, structural racism in correctional facilities. And I just want to highlight what we've done in Suffolk County, particularly around our correctional facility. My predecessor, African American female, made it a point to try to recruit at least 50% of our, at least have at least 50% of each one of our academies, cadet academies, and we have at least 2 every year, be of color, at least 50%, with the aim of trying to get the number of people of color up to the number of people that were incarcerated. On any given day, 65% of my incarcerees are Black or Latino. When we first got there in 2002, that same demographic on the labor side was about 18%. And so we've been very concerted with trying to move up the number of people that we've recruited of color and women, frankly, to work in the department so that we can get some balance there. We've also looked at where people live. We don't have a residency rule as such, but what we found is that, for whatever reason, sometimes officers would get a little bit besides themselves and do or say things that they probably wouldn't have said if they lived in the same community with the people that were incarcerated. And so we were very concerned about trying to recruit also more people from Suffolk County. And lo, these many years later, we have brought that labor force number up into the mid-30s with people of color, but we've also been very concerted when we look at promotions, and all of our promotions are on merit. You have to take tests and pass those tests and pass them well, and then go through a pretty rigorous interview process. But we have also increased the number of women and people of color that are captains, lieutenants, and sergeants now. And so we're getting some parity there. When I first arrived at the department back in 2002, I had a conversation with a young African-American officer, and I asked why there was this reluctance on the part of people of color to try to get on the E-board, the executive board of their unions. And I'm the only sheriff with 2 officer unions. And what I was told is that it was just really difficult, that the culture was not welcoming to people of color, and therefore they didn't even want to attempt. They didn't even want to try to get on the E-board. And for a long time, they would even take promotional tests, which just blew my mind. What are you talking about? Years later, they are taking the test. They are passing the test. They are being promoted. And we are realizing more people of color that are applying to our academies. And so that commission on racism in correctional facilities is something that we wholeheartedly wrap our arms around just to get some parity there.
Thank you, Sheriff Tompkins. A question certainly that comes from the 18 commissions and task forces. It's quite a lot to get going and keep your arms around. So how will the legislature track the progress and effectiveness of these commissions?
I'll chime in. I mean, that's the $1 million question, really, because it really is about the implementation and the follow through. Frankly, some of the commissions have already fallen a little bit behind in terms of the timelines and the appointments that need to be made. So it's going to be a process. I'm the vice chair of the Judiciary Committee on the Senate side, and I know it's going to be a priority of the Judiciary Committee to be holding hearings throughout the session to get progress on these commissions. But unfortunately, sometimes some of our commissions in the state have produced very important legislation. The Foundation Budget Review Commission is just one very high-profile example, which has rewrote the state's education funding formulas, led to the Student Opportunity Act. There's multiple others that have led to real progress real legislation into paper, but not always. So we do need to stay on top of this to make sure that the commissions are producing work product that we can turn into laws.
Thank you. Chief Wynn or Sheriff Tompkins, could you comment on the benefits of these commissions from to the public and how they'll support the mission of public safety?
Certainly. And let me say that one of the things that I was the most pleased that came out of this legislation was the creation of these commissions, particularly the permanent commissions. And this is going to seem like I'm trying to cast blame away from law enforcement, and that is not my intent. But like Sheriff Tompkins, I have a strong working relationship with my sheriff out here in Berkshire County. He was Pittsfield PD before he ran for sheriff. And I can't count the number of times when we've gone through some type of criminal justice reform that the sheriff and I are sitting there and people are lobbing questions at us. We're like, okay, that's great, but I'm the front end and he's the back end. Where are the judges? Where are the probation officers? Where are the clerk magistrates? And people are like, we don't know who they are. You arrested him. He's in your jail. I want to talk to you. And we're like, but we didn't do any. We didn't even swear out that complaint, right? Somebody who's not in this room swore out that complaint. We just went and served the warrant. And so particularly when we look at the other institutions that are in the criminal justice system and the institutions around the criminal justice system, these commissions are going to play a valuable role. So we're evaluating, our school resource officer program, and we've had a school resource officer program for close to 30 years. And one of the things we realized is our school resource officers were assuming bias from teachers. Right. So the teachers were reporting certain things in a certain way, and the officers were taking action based on the observations of the teachers. They're like, well, we had the implicit bias training, go train them. Right. And we started having that conversation last year about our callers. Right. So one of my lieutenants coined this phrase in one of our supervisory meetings. He's like, we have to protect our officers from transfer of bias, because when a reporting party in the community calls dispatch and reports somebody who's suspicious in their neighborhood, are they reporting somebody who's suspicious? Or are they reporting somebody who doesn't look like them? And are we rolling an officer into that neighborhood on the basis of somebody else's bias? And so we had to change our response protocols. And I think that these commissions are going to do a lot at looking at these habits, these structures within our 50 years of 911 history in this country. And they're going to point out some gaps that we need to address.
I would say that, and I agree with everything that Chief Wynn just said. I think the world of these commissions, and I think that it'll bring a very holistic approach to all that we're trying to get accomplished. One commission that I would like to have seen here, though, is a special commission on inclusion. Now, a lot of people talk about diversity, and I think diversity is cool, but diversity is a collection of parts. Inclusion is who's actually sitting at the table and making the real decisions that's going to move any of these organizations forward. And so if the legislators revisit this, I think a commission on inclusion and how that's dealt with, particularly for women and folk of color and others, would be pretty meaningful. But I agree with the chief. I think these commissions are awesome.
Thank you. What I believe we're at now is to move into some more of the questions from the viewers. And there are a number of questions teed up. And I will go from top to bottom with those that have been voted on or pushed to the top. So the first question seems like more of a summary from comments made prior. And I think it's directed at Chief Wynn or Sheriff Tompkins. What are the 2 or 3 major concerns from law enforcement? And I'm going to take that with respect to the act.
I think 2 or 3 main concerns are to ensure that our personnel are still guaranteed some degree of due process, that they're going to know upfront what the process is. There's still a lot of unanswered questions about what this investigative process within the post is going to look like. I know early on, before I was appointed to the commission, when things were still just, the dust was just settling, we were talking to some of our state counterparts and they're like, there's no funding and there's no staffing. So, if in April the post receives a complaint, they're probably just going to have to send it back to the department. was like, well, that's useful, right? Because you just delayed my investigation 3 days. So what is this process going to look like once it's established? And then I would say from my personal perspective, given my background, whoever these post-commission investigators are going to be, they need to be the very best internal affairs investigators in the Commonwealth. We can't just be grabbing people from the street who's like, yeah, I'd like to, investigate cops. It's a very, very highly specific skill set, and it needs to be turned over to a set of experts.
So within corrections, a couple of the concerns that really rise to the top, and one that's really way up at the top, is officer safety, and how they are going to be able to come to work, do their job, and get home safe at night, and that's a big deal. Trauma is a big deal. PTSD is a big deal. And I read a statistic years ago that said the average age of correction officers is 59 years old. That's still a young individual, very young individual. And so officer safety is a big concern in corrections. And then there's equal pay for our officers that work external to the department, particularly they reference it as in the line of duty pay. And clearly officers or corrections officers, they feel if they're out in the community doing this, they would like to be on par with police officers with that in the line of duty pay. And so those are two things that from a corrections standpoint, that's pretty significant.
Thank you. The next question is, do all police departments have body cameras? And if not, should they be required? And I'll put that as a general question to those who want to respond.
In the Commonwealth, all police departments certainly do not have body cameras. I would say the vast majority of the departments in the Commonwealth right now still do not. And this is one of those things that, the Chiefs Association is saying, we've been asking for help and nobody wants to help us. I think most police officers in 2021 think that the value of body cameras far outweighs any negative impact on them. We've seen many more officers exonerated by good body camera footage than we have jammed up on misconduct. But our residents, our citizens don't understand. There are some very peculiar laws in the Commonwealth. And I have said for a number of years, I will not put cameras on my officers until the legislature takes steps to address these concerns. The first is the two-party consent issue. That technically the way the law is written right now, if my officer jumped out to get into a physical altercation and didn't have time to give the recording admonition, they could be accused of a felony. And I'm not gonna put my officer in a situation where that could happen. The other one that causes deep concern for me is we can't get any clarification on what aspects of the footage would be considered public records. And I'm gravely uncomfortable with the fact that under the Massachusetts Public Records Law, if I started recording today, tomorrow, any citizen could come in and demand footage of any of our interactions. And that would include an interaction in your private home if there wasn't protected information that I could redact. So until we get some clear guidance from the legislature on what the consent requirement is going to be and what is going to be considered a public record, I think most chiefs are kind of hands off. That's just the legal aspects. The operational aspects are huge. I don't know what the current status is, but I know under the previous pilot, Boston had to turn the camera pilot off because the DA's office couldn't keep up with the discovery requests, right? Once you start recording it, the volume of video now becomes evidence and it has to be processed. I was in a Chiefs meeting last month and I'd never thought I'd hear this in the Commonwealth with our home rule status. I finally heard police chiefs say, you know what, Massachusetts, buy us the cameras, take the video, right? Create a new division to store that video and handle the public records requests. We'll put the cameras out tomorrow because where I am, these little 5-officer departments, these part-time departments, they're not going to have time and resources to process that video. So, and it's very expensive. Video storage is incredibly expensive.
I just say all of that is exactly right, and that is on the legislature because there have been individual pilots and there have been individual departments that have been implementing or trying to use body cameras, but widespread adoption is dependent on exactly what Chief Wynn's discussed. And I mean, just think about for a moment, I mean, routine officer stops, a domestic violence call. You know, if an officer is going into a home where there's a domestic violence situation and they're actively recording, there's not clarity right now in Massachusetts law about if the next morning, if all of that video is requested as a public record, you know, whether you would have to turn that all over. And there's serious privacy concerns there, obviously. So that's on us. That's on the lawmakers and on policymakers to work through that. But I personally do think body cameras are an important tool, and you know, I do think that they serve an important role. But we do need to clarify some of those privacy and data and discovery issues. And the funding, the departments need money because they're expensive to put them forward. And I don't want to see money taken away from programming or from a lot of these community-based programs that we've worked so hard to get going and expand to fund the body cameras. That should be coming from a different source.
Thank you. The next question, and during the comments, it was referenced a couple of times, the organized opposition. So the question is, the first part is who are they, and what do they want? And I'll allow you to determine how you want to talk about who they are, but certainly the aspect of, is it just they don't believe there's an issue, or they just have a different opinion about how to resolve the issue? Senator or Representative Williams, you're both on mute right now, so.
Rep Williams, you want to go first, and then I'll follow you.
I just said that it was widely reported and televised that the bulk of the opposition came from the patrolman unions and the supervisors and their families. And, you know, I never realized that there were so many advocacy groups for police officers. Then when we started passing this bill, we averaged probably 200 or 300 emails a day from the opposition, friends of the family and all that. And I've always supported law enforcement and believed that, you know, most of our police officers are great human beings. But that's where the bulk of the opposition. And then also you had the Trumpers. The Trumpers, his folks were really involved in stirring the pot. And at this time, so that, from my perspective, that's where the most of the opposition that I observed was the Trumpers, police officers, their families, and the advocacy groups that supported them.
I'll jump in on this just from, you know, a chief's point of view. And I'm well aware that my patrol officers union, my supervisors union, and the coalition that they're affiliated with, they were very vocal in opposition to this, because they were as equally ill-informed about some aspects of this as some proponents on the other side. And so we talked about it earlier. There is a clear confusion in the Commonwealth about the difference between qualified immunity and absolute immunity. And there was a persistent belief early in these negotiations that police officers enjoyed absolute immunity, which is not the case. And there was also a belief that qualified immunity only applies to police, which is not the case. But I had members of my department's family saying, if my officer goes to work and they do something wrong and they get in trouble, they're going to take my house. No, they're not going to do that today, and they're not going to do that after police reform. But that was the message that was being sent from some of the larger unions to their members.
Yeah, I can just say, being on the receiving end of being on the receiving end of these emails and phone calls and community meetings and town halls and other things I was doing through the whole period, there was a lot of misinformation. There was frankly a lot of scare tactics that were done of police and their families. And I did my best. I'm not going to say I was perfect or did it 100%, but I did my best to personally respond to every email or call that was personal in nature. A form email less so, but if a police officer or if a police officer's family was personally writing to me or calling me with questions about the law, I did my best to talk to each of them. And my experience was that after you had a conversation and you kind of walk through what the thought process was about the different elements and what the goals were, a lot of people did kind of come around, or at least cool down a little bit. So I do think the key here is communication. I think that there were breakdowns in communication at several points. which is never good. But there was a very ideological opposition as well, and that was harder to overcome. There were unanswered questions. There was misinformation that people had that can get cleaned up. But there was also a very, and we know what the political climate was like. I mean, still is, but was especially like in the summer and in the fall of this past year, and it was very, very directed at at this bill and this legislation. So, we had a lot of people calling that, they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear the other side, and they didn't want to hear the explanations. But not all. I mean, that was not everyone. In fact, I would say that was probably a minority of the outreach I got, because when I talked to the officers or their families directly, there was a lot of good dialogue, and I learned from them. I learned from them too, in conversations with law enforcement.
Thank you. The next question is one where someone observed that in their city, there seems to be a lot of effort to taking funding from police for specialized interveners in mental health situations, rather than having mental health specialists working with police in these interventions. And so what do you think about such decisions for that approach?
So I'm very fortunate. We have a co-responder program with our local mental health provider that's over 5 years old. We've had unbelievable results in decreasing the number of police transports for people in crisis due to mental health as a result of it. But we almost lost the program last year, because this is a very, very, not just highly specialized, but it takes a very particular type of person to do that type of work. And so last year, during my budget process hearing, we happened to roll out on a crisis call, and we didn't have our co-responder available. And we ended up, taking the person in custody without incident, much lower degree of force than maybe we would have historically. And we got him into treatment, which was the goal that we wanted to. And it came up during my budget hearing. Didn't have the co-responder. It would have come out better if we'd had the co-responder. And so when I went into work the next morning, I ran into my co-responder and I asked him, I said, "Hey, you going on that call the next time it comes in?" And he just laughed. He said, "Not without you," right? Because there are crisis situations that are emerging, that are in progress, that mental health providers are not trained to do. Now there's ways to get there. We could train some medics or some firefighters in a higher degree of crisis intervention training and maybe have an interim step. But even medics and firefighters are trained to wait until a scene is cleared of weapons before they go in. So depending on how that initial call comes in and what the information is that's conveyed to dispatch, you're always going to need to have some type of police response. I'm a huge proponent of the co-responder model, but it took a long time for my officers to get to the point where, they'll take a mental health call now, and when they're en route, they'll say, "I'm 3 minutes out. Start Mr. Collins, get him rolling," because they've got that experience. But it's so I had a conversation with a community member this week. This isn't something we're going to fix in one budget cycle. We recognize the need for it now. It's going to take years to get a process and a program in place.
What I'd like to say from the standpoint of corrections is, over the 20 some odd years that I've worked at the Sheriff's Department, we have had to create full-blown mental health and substance abuse teams. This was not something that we had prior to the department. I mean, full-blown teams. I would say upwards of 65, 70% of the population is suffering from some form of substance abuse or mental health issues. And the thing that really complicates the situation for us, frustrates us, no offense to the legislators on the call, both gentlemen who I know well and like a lot, is that legislators have jurisdiction over dollars. And because the count or the number of bodies is going down, we are consistently being told that, well, the number is going down, so your money should go down. Your budget, your should go down. And it doesn't work that way. You have to expend individuals that are with us, cost so much more money to take care of. So we may have fewer bodies, but their care is exceedingly expensive. And then we are historically level funded to prior years. I think last year we were level funded to 2017 numbers or 2018 numbers. And so it makes it really difficult. And then we have to find additional revenue streams. And in a lot of cases, we are prohibited from doing that, and so we're in a real ticklish situation when you talk about mental health and substance abuse care. And I'll close by saying that, and I've said this to these gentlemen and others, legislators really do need to put more beds outside of a correction facility for mental health and substance abuse, because a lot of these people are committing crime, and a lot of it is petty crime, to either feed an addiction or they have a mental maladjustment. And so they really shouldn't be incarcerated, frankly, And so that's where we come down on the mental health / substance abuse issue.
And if I can pivot off of the sheriff's claim about resources, similarly in field situations, right? If you want my police officers to be more highly trained and have more alternatives to take somebody into custody with less injury, that means more training time. That means more equipment options in the car and on their belt. You're not going to get the outcome you want by removing funding, right? If you tell me you want safer outcomes, I need more people with more training and more equipment to guarantee those outcomes.
Thank you. Representative Williams or Senator Lesser? Representative Williams, you're on mute or we can't hear you.
You got me muted. Thank you. I think that the city of Springfield has a pilot program with Bear Sarno that works with the Behavior Health Network for the mental health aspect. That's a pilot program that's trying to adhere to what the intent of the legislators were in terms of trying to, in the Black and Latino caucus was never for defunding the police department, maybe reallocating resources to different positions, because during and as Senator Lesser said, last July and August was a turbulent time in America. You had the election going on, you had Trump, you had Biden. It was a terrible climate. But they did a poll when the national survey came out to defund the police department, and they polled most Black communities throughout the country. And the most Black and brown communities said no. 85% supported the police department. And in fact, some said we want more police department. We want more police officers. So that's just to put a coin in that to what Sheriff Tompkins is talking about, is treatment on demand. We've been talking about that for years. When you have a mental health situation or drug addiction situation, and that person really wants to go to recovery, the only place they can go now really is to the jails. That's the only treatment on demand program is Hampden County and Suffolk County, my sheriff and Sheriff Tompkins. That's the only treatment on demand program. So we have to really, and I know Senator Lesser is vice chair this year, and we really have to talk about that treatment on demand, because folks need beds for addiction and for mental health situations.
Yeah, I just, I just want to give a thank you to Sheriff Tompkins, who's been a leader on this for a long time. And, people might be familiar with in Hampden County, Sheriff Cochey's Section 35 program, which is one of the best there is. But, just to give an example of the disparity we have, a person literally died being driven from Hampden County out to a treatment facility in Eastern Mass. They died in transport because there was no bed available in Western Mass. And, frankly, I think that's a national disgrace. We are a wealthy state. We have a lot of, resources. We have a lot of know-how. And it's not fair to dump every societal challenge on the backs of a responding officer. They do need more resources. They need more, we need significantly more community addiction services and treatment facilities than we have. And they need to be adequately funded. And that is a very, very important point to repeat over and over again. And by the way, as fantastic as that Section 35 program is that Sheriff Cochey runs, and I've been a big champion of supporting funding for that program, to Sheriff Tompkins' point, you have to enter the criminal justice system to qualify for that treatment. And that's the problem. We need that treatment before people enter. I have literally had constituents call my office and beg for their child or their loved one to get arrested so that they can get treatment. That is horrific when you think about it. We should have a system that gives the treatment up front so that people are not entering the criminal justice system to get it. But really important element of this.
Mr. If I might, I want to follow that because in Suffolk County, we are also looking to do a Section 35 program. And Section 35 basically is, these are people without criminal engagement that are in an incarcerated setting to get the care that they need. And there are a lot of people that aren't for that. You know, they haven't committed a crime, so they shouldn't be in an incarceration facility. What Sheriff Cochi has done is he's taken one of his units, and it almost looks like a college dormitory. I'm sure you've seen it, Senator. It looks like a college dormitory area. You know, the officers are in khakis and pullovers. They're not in full uniform. And there's a lot of movement in that area, but in that section, but a lot of people don't want that to happen. And I believe I think there's a lawsuit pending for men. I know there was one, I think that the state lost for women, and people down here in Southeastern Mass. There are a lot of folks down here that are not trying to hear Section 35 down here, but we would love to have one because, you know, we have a lot of people down here in Boston that really need that help. And if we can help them, our contention is whether they committed a crime or not, if we can help them, but we have the resources and the resources aren't outside of these walls, well, then let us do it. But we haven't been able to do it. And I applaud Sheriff Cochi because he's doing it and he's taking the money out of his budget. I don't think, and Senator, you probably know better, I'm not sure whether he's getting an additional appropriation for that program, but he is told the sheriffs he's going to do it. You know, Sean Nicky.
Well, we've tried. Yeah, I mean, to this point, we've tried to get extra money specifically for that program, and because of this opposition you're alluding to, it's been hard. But that's a topic for another day.
And I must say, we're going to have to leave it there. It's amazing how fast time goes. But thank you all so much. I learned a lot. I'm sure for our viewers, we're better informed and certainly better positioned to continue to engage. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Moderator Johnson.
You're quite welcome. And my last duty as moderator is to again remind the viewers, please read the act. There's too much in it for us to cover it in entirety here, but you got a good taste tonight. And to turn it over to Sire Archon Weeks for closing remarks and next steps. Sire Archon Weeks.
To my fellow Greeks, I got to give Omega Psi Phi Delta Chi chapter a shout out because Stevie Tompkins did his thing. Okay, thank you.
All right.
Well, thank you, panelists. That was an outstanding.
Where's my president?
And I thought the information was fantastic there. I know there is much more we could cover, and in time we may with your support. But on behalf of the Beta Sigma Boule, kudos to Senator Lesser, Rep. Williams, Sheriff Tompkins, Police Chief Wynn, and of course our moderator, Archon Johnson, and much gratitude to our Criminal Justice Committee that's led by Archon Lee Hines that planned and developed this program, of course, with technical support from our Archon, Greg Thomas. By the way, they're also involved and have been involved in doing an expungement work as well. Folks who have getting records, helping them to get those records cleared up is another action of the Criminal Justice Initiative of the Beta Sigma Boule. And a big thanks to our entire Beta Sigma Boule for their financial, logistical support and guidance. These are the men who are behind supporting this effort, making sure that they support our committee and support me in making this part of our W.E.B. Du Bois series. So, and a special appreciation to the audience for your attendance and participation. And, as mentioned before, if you want to share any comments or suggestions, please forward them to Beta Sigma Boule, all one word, .org/contact, betasigmaboule.org/contact. And we encourage you, as you've heard, to review the law in more detail, but also to participate in community opportunities when opportunities come about so that your voice is heard and you could participate in conversations about this with your local friends and neighbors and other interested parties. We think that, though we couldn't deal with everything, we think that there's opportunities in the community and hopefully we can generate some more for you to participate in those. And finally, we know that the saying that nothing will work unless you do. So while this is about police equity and accountability, it is a responsibility of all of us to make this law effective. So in the future, we plan to hold forums within our W.E.B. Du Bois Public Policy Series. We're going to be looking at issues of health, particularly as they affect Black men. And we're also going to be looking at wealth development within the next 12 months or so with webinars as well. So I want to thank everyone for participating in this and giving us a real riveting and interesting conversations that should lead to more discussions and more, because this is not something that's going to be a one-stop. We hope to come back around with this in time to see where have we gone, what have we learned, and what are the next steps that need to happen. And so Archon Johnson, just turning back to you, I just want to say thanks to all of you and the panelists and our audience, particularly, for really participating in this and making sure that we have an opportunity to really talk to folks in the community, and hope that you'll talk to your legislators and your police and whoever's in your community about this incredibly important act that was passed in 2020. So I thank you, and I wish everyone a good evening, and please do some follow-up on this. This is a subject that's very important to all of us. So good evening, folks.